be like you want to tell the difference between the robot and the human, right? I think there was an early experiment where Microsoft had some speech AI where they had, or Microsoft or Google or one of them, where they put the ahs and the ums and the speech ticks that a normal person does.
Yes.
And people were like a little offended that the robot sounded that way because it made the robotic voice feel very human.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Engatica's interview series. I'm your host Nimilika and we're really glad to have you join us today. Today we have the machine learning solutions engineer at Hugging Face, Rajiv Shah. Welcome to the show, Rajiv.
And thank you so much for having me. Excited to be on today.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. The Engatica interview series is a powerhouse of insights from industry experts and influencers from around the world, a platform that provides the latest news on AI, automation, and technologies that will help you grow your business. Come, be a part of a community, learn, share, and grow with us. So, Rajiv, I'll start off with a machine learning question. So, what are the biggest developments that are going on in AI right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous time in the space of AI with everything that's going on. And we can think about it in terms of how we search the internet, how we can talk to Alexa or Siri. All of these developments are happening because of advancements in the last couple of years around things like large language models that have just opened up whole new kind of vistas for data scientists and AI folks.
Yes. So, can you tell us more about the large language models?
Yeah. So kind of a little bit of a history is for a long time, we always traditionally did machine learning by giving a lot of examples to the computer. And then from that, the computer would learn how to do something. Now, what's happened in the last couple of years, we figured out how to build these really just immense language models that contain billions of parameters. And the way to think about it is the traditional models we had probably had a handful of knobs and switches that we used for example, if you built a churn model to identify who's going to go or not. These new models have literally like billions of switches. So it's an incredibly complex type of model. But because of that complexity, they're really able to figure out the nuances of languages. And that's why my 7-year-old can talk to a computer just in their natural voice because these computers are so good now at understanding how language works. And that has a ton of applications far beyond just recognizing speech.
True. So what kinds of use cases is that going to drive?
Yeah, I mean, some of the most fascinating use cases for me are not the typical things of classification and regression that we learn as data scientists, but there's a whole new wave of generative AI where we're using the computer to generate new content.
True.
And you know, a simple example is for software developers, if they've used things like GitHub Copilot, where now you just give it a couple of instructions like, hey, I want a software program that does this, and boom, you know, you get it. It's not going to replace developers at all, but developers are finding it like a very valuable tool and something that does accelerate. And so that's one example of kind of that generative piece. But as these language models start to understand kind of the world that we live in, they can start to help and assist us with lots of tasks, whether it's filling out kind of code for developers, or if it's writing a short essay. And, you know, again, my 7-year-old kid is going to take advantage of this, but you can nowadays, right, just say, hey, I want an essay on this topic in this style, and the computer will write it for you.
And these models, these generative models are trained on lots of data. And how do we make sure that there's no bias there?
Yeah, that's a big concern with these models. I mean, the early on, researchers just try to grab every piece of data they can and shove them into these models. But right, data have a history. They have people that own them, the people that contributed to them for a specific reason. And so once we reflect on that and also, you know, take into account legal issues, as well as, you know, the world that was 10 years, 20, 30 years ago might not be the exact same world that we want 10 years from now that's in that model. And when we train a model on that historical data, it's going to come with that historical baggage, and we have to carry that forward. So there's a lot of work going on in this area in terms of, one, understanding the biases that are in data, so we know and we're aware of that, and we can then try to correct that, as well as thinking about, how should we own these language models? And the same thing happens for images too, where these images are scraped from huge repositories all over, where people didn't necessarily intend for it to be part of this. So lots of interesting questions and kind of areas for concern that people are exploring.
Yeah. And these language models that we talked about, they generate text. And there are many use cases where people use this for, suppose, content creation for social media. Does the data make sure that there is no loss of perspective in the content that is created?
Oh, that's a very good concern. And because the content that's often kind of written is based on that historical. So in some cases, we have, for example, we've worked with companies that have, let's say, an advertising agency that has a particular style that they want.
Yes.
And so they might want that particular style reflected, and can we retrain or fine tune that model to reflect that style? So that's like the good case, you can see it. For the bad case, you can see it as in, if you're a smaller community, that a lot of your data isn't inside these language models, right? These language models are going to weigh in with what the majority says, and that's what's going to fill, and your kind of diverse thought could be suffocated a little bit by these language models. And so that's a huge concern as well.
And are these language models able to train themselves with time?
So one interesting thing, and one of the reasons why we were able to train these language models that are so large, is we have techniques actually where they almost kind of train themselves, where the way it traditionally worked is, if I, for example, wanted to train a model on, are people going to churn or not? Are people going to stay as subscribers? I would have to get a list of people who stayed, and I'd have to get a list of people who left, and I'd have to label each one of those people. And that takes a ton of time.
Yes.
But for these language models, we're almost allow them to self-train, because what we do is we just teach them to predict the next word. Can they figure out what the next word in a sentence is? Much easier task. We don't have to label the data. We just give it lots of examples. We just generate that, and it can learn by itself to try to predict the next word. And right, as it gets better and better, it better understands the nuances of language and what words fill in. And so that's been in the part of the reason for the amazing growth of this, is it's very easy to kind of build these types of models, because you don't have to do what we traditionally had to do and spend a lot of time getting that labeled data.
Right. So are there any concerns with all this models?
Yeah, I mean, there's concerns about the bias that we talked about, the ownership of these. And, one of the things that I've been very happy about is there's a much larger movement to thinking about using these tools in a responsible way. And so you see people that are, focused on responsible AI. At Hugging Face, for example, we've built out responsible licenses to use around models. So I think people are recognizing that, these models do carry some of these problems with them, and we need to think carefully about how they're going to be used and who could be impacted. And, not just from a dollars and cents kind of way. And so I'm glad that we've got a lot more people thinking about that nowadays, because it is something that has, can have negative repercussions.
Now that you've touched upon responsible AI, can you talk a little bit about ethical AI?
So how would you what do you see as the difference between the two? I'm kind of curious why you're drawing the line between.
That is also my question. What is responsible AI and what is ethical AI?
This is a tough one for me to do off the top of my head, like that, and what the definitions of them. I think one thing is ethics can. I don't really want to go into this. I don't know enough about the space to kind of tease apart both of those two right now.
Okay, no problem. So what advice would you give to people who are coming into AI or want to have a career in AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an exciting place. And even if you're not a software engineer or software developer, data scientist, I think there's a lot to learn about just what the capabilities are of these tools, because the thing that what's happening in AI is, and you talked about your own experience building these tools and using transformers, is the libraries and the tools for doing this are just becoming easier and easier to use. We can think about it as low code environments. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had such an explosion in NLP, is because it's so much easier. For when I started off, you'd have to, code up, 30, 50, 60 lines of code, where nowadays 2 lines of code get you that exact same result, even a better, actually a more accurate, better result. So just that ability to kind of bring this low code environment to a much larger people, I think has a tremendous influence. And whether you see it directly as in you're coding it yourself, but it's in being embedded in a lot of these other tools that we use. And that's why I think it's good for people to understand things like generative AI and how computers can do this, because you might not be coding that up, but you're going to be using the tools, and you're going to be advocating, and your company's going to be building these types of capabilities. So understanding kind of what's out there is really valuable.
Yeah. And how important is data for all these companies who are using the large language models?
Oh, it's super important. And so I think sometimes when we talk about data science, we like to talk about algorithms and the latest research papers, and we get lost in all those, like, what's the latest thing from DeepMind? But at the end of the day, having high quality data is the biggest differentiator. So for organizations that take time to curate their data, to understand their data, that's going to be a much richer quality of fuel that's going to power their models. And so I think one of the things I've seen is a turn towards things like data-centric AI, where folks are spending a little bit more time emphasizing the quality of data, because as somebody who's built these models, like, the quality of data is super important, often even much more important than the algorithm you might use.
Yes. So why do companies hire data analysts?
So data analysts have a tremendous role, where as companies have this just a flood of data, right? Because everything is kind of turned into numbers and letters that we can kind of analyze. The first piece of that is just getting a sense of that. And a lot of times as data analysts, you're just responsible for taking that huge mass of data that's out there and just trying to make sense. Like, can you give me a report and summarizing what's happened over the last year or two? And for many times, that's super valuable. You don't always need to build a machine learning model to solve a problem within business. And so that's why we need so many of those data analysts, because the majority of problems can often be kind of understood, recognized, and people can figure out how to solve it without having to build an AI solution at all.
Yeah. And these companies that take these models and use them for any use case, how often should they keep training or, tweaking their parameters?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question, because these models are built off some static data. And we all know the world is changing, right? Like, there's developments happen all the time. Like COVID was something, for example, that blew apart most people's data science models, because it was kind of this black swan event that had never happened before and people hadn't expected. So there's a strong element of, for the problem that you're solving, is understanding and monitoring how that world is changing, because if that world changes too much, then it's time to retrain your models like that. So I think that's the general practitioner. Then also, as we build these language models, you can think about how our language changes over time, right? New slangs, new words that come up all the time, right? If your language model is trained on something that was 3 years ago, if somebody says the word mid, you're not going to understand exactly what they mean versus now versus what they did 2 or 3 years ago. So there's one of the things, and Hugging Face is working on this, is helping people develop kind of online language models where they're trained on a regular basis. So that way they have the freshest changes, because whether it's things like slang, but also world leaders, right? If your language model thinks that Trump is still president, it's going to give you some weird answers on some things. So yeah, US based, sorry. But yeah.
Yeah. And there's an explosion in deepfake audio and video. Can you touch upon that, and what are the concerns around it?
Yeah, I mean, so, and just to back up, so what deepfake allows us to do is, because these tools have gotten so good
Mm.
at rendering audio, rendering video, that we can
Mm.
literally take somebody else's image and likeness and use that in a different way. And so, right, some things are entertaining. Like on TikTok, I see the deep fake of Tom
Yes.
Cruise, and they put Tom Cruise in a variety of different things, and it's just for fun. But it does get at really deep issues of like, how can we trust any types of images and any type of text if it's so easy? Because at this
Mm.
point, like anybody with like a high school education that spends a couple hours with computers can kind of pull this stuff off. And
Mm.
right, it drives at authenticity of how can we trust things, for companies and people that make their money off their image or likeness. Right, that's a tremendous thing. I think I just saw something. Somebody had a space that related to Disney this morning that I was seeing, and right,
Okay.
is Disney going to come after them because they have cartoon characters that look like Disney cartoon characters? And so, not
Mm.
exactly deep fake, but you can see there's a lot of issues that, as we can kind of mold and change this new world of audio and texts, and anybody can kind of create anything within it, like how do we use our old boundaries where people were like, this was my image property, for example.
Yeah. And as a closing question, use these assistants, Alexa, Siri, or Google Assistant on a
Yeah.
daily basis. And as of now, they are still robotic. They don't understand maybe the nuances of accents or few words when we just speak very fast.
Yeah.
So how long will it take for these assistants to speak like us? Or will it happen? Is it not ideal for them to speak like humans?
That's a really deep question. There, right there, it could be like you want to tell the difference between the robot and the human, right? I think there was an early experiment where Microsoft had some speech AI, where they had, or Microsoft or Google or one of them, where they put the ahs and the ums and the speech ticks that a
Hmm.
normal person
Yes,
does.
yes,
And people were
yes.
like a little offended that the robot sounded that way because it made the robotic voice feel very human, when it
Mm,
had that piece. So I that's an interesting question of how do we want to allow and how to allow it. But
mm,
I see continuing developments and improvements. It's not as fast as it was, over like the last year or two, in terms of audio speech, but I mean, it's continuing to get better and better. And I think one of the things that often happens is that it's not a one-sided change too. It's not just the computers get better. We as humans also over time figure out like how to talk to computers as well. So that's why I think
mm.
it will happen where we will get much closer, because we'll have a kind of just, if you talk to a baby or a toddler, right, you have a little bit of a different voice for talking to them.
Yes.
Like we'll almost, get used to having a specific voice of when we talk to our phones, like that, just to kind of increase the communication. Like that is my guess. But I think it's a lot of fun to
That is
watch
a
what all this
very
stuff is going on.
wonderful answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I never thought about it that way, that we speak differently on phone, we speak differently on a meet, and I might sound different with my friend over here. Oh, yes. That is a very nice question. I'll have a thought about that. That
Good.
was
Good.
wonderful.
Thank you.
And before we close our conversation, do you want to leave any sound bites for our audience?
I don't want to leave any sound bites, but I do want to tell everybody that I have a TikTok, although I am posting them on Instagram, where I
Okay.
like to take a lot of these short data science concepts and make very little quick videos to explain them. So if people like kind of hearing me, you don't want to read a full paper, it's a fun way to kind of follow some of the latest data science pieces.
All of us here are going to follow you from
All
today.
right. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I had a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
For more content, subscribe to Engati and tap the bell icon to get access to exclusive content from thought leaders from around the world. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you with a new expert soon.